My parents sold our home to chase their dream of traveling the country, leaving me homeless at 18. And now, after our marriage fell apart, my mom wants to move in with me. Let me take you back to how it all began. Growing up, my relationship with my parents was troubled, to say the least. From an early age, I could sense I wasn't wanted. I'd try everything to earn their love, their approval, but eventually, I stopped trying altogether. By middle school, the shift was clear. I began retreating into myself, realizing it was pointless to seek affection from people who didn't care to give it. By high school, our interactions were limited to bare necessities. I'd only speak to them when I absolutely had to, and even then, I felt like a burden. It wasn't that I didn't want a relationship with my parents, it's that they made it painfully obvious they didn't want one with me. I felt trapped, knowing they were the only people I could rely on, yet completely unwelcomed in their lives. Ironically, my dad was a pediatrician, and my mom a middle school science teacher, both great with other people's kids but emotionally absent for their own. By then, I'd resigned myself to the fact that we were just strangers sharing a house. My dad worked late, and my mom, though home earlier, avoided any meaningful interaction. We barely spoke. We lived in separate rooms, existing under the same roof but worlds apart. When I turned 18, my parents sat me down and made one thing abundantly clear: I was now an adult. Their legal obligation to support me was over. They framed it as a push toward independence, but I saw through it. It wasn't about teaching me self-reliance, they simply wanted to cut ties. At that point, I hadn't applied to college yet. I decided to take a gap year, save up, and build a foundation before taking on the financial burden of higher education. I managed to find a job at a local supermarket and, for the first time, felt a small sense of pride. But that feeling didn't last long. Just a few weeks into my job, my parents dropped a bombshell: they were selling the house. They told me they planned to quit their jobs and travel the country with the proceeds. Their reasoning? They'd saved for this dream their whole lives, and now that I had a job, they felt no responsibility toward me anymore. I was blindsided. I'd barely started saving, and now I was expected to figure out housing on my own. I begged them to reconsider, to delay their plans for just a few months so I could prepare, but they refused. They were steadfast, indifferent to the fact that their decision would leave me homeless. My mom's words still haunt me: "You're an adult now. We don't need to take responsibility for you anymore. The house is our property, and we can do whatever we want with it. Where you live is not our concern." Those words cut deep. I pleaded, I argued, but they wouldn't budge. That conversation escalated into a full-blown fight, one that ended with me storming out. It was the last time I saw or spoke to them. They didn't reach out after I left, and honestly, I hadn't expected them to. I told them exactly how I felt, that they were terrible people. I even hoped, in my anger, that they'd face the consequences of their actions. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a much longer story. The moment I stormed out of my parents' house, frustration coursing through my veins, I was too consumed by anger to care about the consequences. I had just cursed out my parents, disregarding their age and the fact that they were the ones who raised me. To me, they had crossed a line, choosing their selfishness over my future. But as I slammed the door behind me, reality hit me hard. I had nowhere to go. No relatives would take me in. My parents had burned those bridges long ago, alienating both sides of the family. They never visited for holidays or attended family events, leaving me disconnected from everyone. And with us living in another state, even reaching out to distant relatives was out of the question. My friends? All of them were away at college. I couldn't impose on their families, showing up unannounced like some runaway. Awkward didn't even begin to describe how that would feel. So, desperate and without a plan, I took a chance, a leap of faith, really, and made one call that changed everything. The person I reached out to was a coworker from the supermarket where I worked. She handled the makeup department, and while we weren't officially together, we'd shared enough playful banter to grow close. She was 2 years older than me, smart, and carried her own set of scars. Like me, she had no safety net. Her father, an addict, had left when she turned 18, and her mother was too self-absorbed to care about her future. She'd been on her own ever since, working tirelessly to save for cosmetology school. When I explained my situation, she didn't hesitate. "Come over," she said. "You can stay with me." Her words were a lifeline. Without her, I'd have been lost. It was winter, and the cold alone might have broken me. But she opened her tiny apartment to me, even though she barely had enough for herself. That act of kindness spoke volumes about who she was. For months, I didn't pay rent. Instead, I chipped in for groceries and utilities while saving up what little I could. Gradually, I started contributing more, and before long, our friendship grew into something neither of us had planned. We became inseparable, partners in every sense of the word. Initially, I thought I'd only stay at the supermarket for a year or so, but cutting ties with my parents changed my perspective. I worked harder than ever, determined to build a life on my own terms. Eventually, I earned a promotion to floor supervisor, a recognition of my dedication, and the increased pay allowed us to breathe a little easier. Meanwhile, my wife, yes, we're married now, finally started cosmetology school. She juggles her classes with part-time shifts at the store, and though it's not easy, we've built a life we're proud of. For the first time, things felt stable. That is, until last week. It started with a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I foolishly opened it without checking. Before I could process what was happening, my mother was hugging me tightly, her bags already on the ground beside her. I froze. 5 years of silence, and here she was, standing on my doorstep as if nothing had happened. When I finally found my voice, I asked, "Why are you here?" She pulled back, her face clouded with sadness, and told me a story that sounded almost unreal. After traveling and settling in California, my father had dropped a bombshell. He was having an affair with a waitress and planned to leave her. My mother, blindsided and humiliated, fought to save their marriage. But when it became clear he was set on starting a new life with this other woman, she chose to walk away with her dignity intact. Now, she was here, asking for a place to stay, claiming she needed to save for the divorce and avoid wasting money on rent so close to retirement. And just like that, my past and present collided in the most unexpected, unwelcome way. To take a deep breath and explain what was going on. Her sobs were uncontrollable, her face flushed with emotion, and her hands trembled as she clutched at her scarf. It was like watching a dam break, years of bottled-up emotion spilling out in the form of tears and unintelligible murmurs. I stood there, torn between wanting to walk away and feeling the undeniable pull of compassion. The parking lot felt oddly silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath to hear what she had to say. Finally, she managed to get out a few fragmented words. "I have nowhere else to go," she stammered between gasps. "I don't know what to do." Her vulnerability was startling. It was as if the woman who had always seemed so unyielding, so dismissive, had been replaced by a shadow of her former self. I leaned against the car door, crossing my arms as I tried to process her words. This was the same person who had told me I needed to fend for myself, who had left without a second thought, and now, here she was, asking me for the very support she had once denied me. "Why now?" I finally asked, my voice firmer than I intended. "Why come to me after all this time, after everything that's happened?" Her tears didn't stop, but she managed to string together a response. "I made mistakes," she whispered, barely audible. "I know I wasn't there for you. I know I hurt you. But I'm desperate." The word desperate hung in the air like a heavy fog. For a moment, I felt an ache of pity. But then, memories of my own pain, of sleepless nights wondering why I was never good enough, came rushing back. I let out a slow breath and replied, "You're right. You did hurt me. And you didn't just hurt me, you abandoned me when I needed you most. Do you even realize how much damage that caused?" Her tears began anew, but this time, I didn't feel the same pang of guilt. I had spent too many years swallowing my pain, and now it was my turn to be heard. "I've rebuilt my life," I continued, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've created something good, despite everything you put me through. And now you expect me to just forget all of that because you're in trouble? It doesn't work like that." She looked at me, her eyes swollen and red. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered again, her voice trembling. For a moment, I felt the tiniest crack in my resolve. But then, I remembered the chaos she had already brought back into my life, the harassment, the manipulation. And I knew I had to stay strong, for my own sake and for the life I had built with my wife. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice soft but resolute. "But this is not my responsibility anymore. You made your choices, and now, I have to make mine." Her face crumpled in despair, but I gently moved past her, opened my car door, and got inside. As I drove away, her image in the rearview mirror grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. My chest felt heavy, but I knew I had done the right thing. I invited her to sit in my car so she could collect herself before we talked. Truthfully, if it weren't for her little outburst, I probably wouldn't have even suggested it. But here we were. It felt necessary to mention this after the last update. People had been quick to call me all sorts of unwelcome names just for being human. So let me make this clear, the reason I haven't contacted the police or a lawyer yet is purely out of humanity. Sure, there are practical reasons too. It's an exhausting, costly, and time-consuming process, but primarily, it's about compassion. Not everyone has the time or resources for that kind of battle. Anyway, once she settled in the passenger seat, it took her a while to calm down. Eventually, though, the words spilled out. She told me how, ever since they moved to California, my father had been acting strangely. When she discovered his affair, it shattered her. She said she came back because she couldn't bear being in the same place as him anymore. It was a constant reminder of how much he'd hurt her. And now, she was relying on me. She admitted she had no money, having borrowed from friends in California just to make the trip. Her desperation was palpable. She explained how she quit her job years ago to travel with my father and never worked again. In California, she'd been a stay-at-home wife, completely dependent on him financially. With their marriage now over, she had nowhere to go. She hadn't maintained ties with friends here, and her family had long since stopped caring. I was, quite literally, her last option. Hearing this, I couldn't help but feel disappointed. After everything, I told her the most I could do was give her some money for her expenses, but that was it. Letting her stay with me? Absolutely not. I didn't trust her enough, not after everything she'd put me through. She had no reasonable right to expect that from me. My response didn't sit well with her. She grew visibly angry and snapped that she didn't want my help anyway. With that, she slammed the car door shut with far more force than necessary, storming off in a way that ensured I knew how upset she was. The next day at work, she didn't show up. And honestly, I think she finally got the message. Maybe she's staying away for good. At least, that's what I hope, because I'm beyond exhausted. I don't have the energy to keep dealing with this.